Tansitayo ni tutamtik, Raylene Whitford Nitsigasan, Nehyoskomina, Afitawagusan. All I just said in my traditional language, which is Cree, is hello, everybody. My name is Raylene Whitford. I'm Cree Métis. I'm a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta, and it is an absolute honor to be with you all today for this amazing panel. So first, I'll give a land acknowledgement. It is always a great honor to be asked to acknowledge the land that we stand on and the first peoples of this land. So today I'm joining you from Ayapeao-Sagaigan, which is now known commonly as Buck Lake in Alberta, which is in Treaty 6 and Métis Nation Region 4. This area is a traditional gathering place for the Cree and Saulteaux people, and it's a place where for thousands of years our ancestors gathered around the lake to fish, harvest medicines, and to trade. And today it is in the center and the heart of Canada's energy industry. So I'm mindful that you might be joining us today from another treaty region, another Métis Nation, unceded land, or even different part of the world. So I encourage us all to reflect that wherever we are, we stand on land that carries the footsteps and the hearts of Indigenous people and who have been here and will continue to be here for many thousands of years. As I said before, my name is Raylene Whitford, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator for this panel of incredible First Nations women today. I'm a member of the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board and the chair of TC Energy's Indigenous Advisory Council. I'm also the founder of Canadian Energy, which is a consultancy that supports the empowerment of Indigenous peoples in the energy sector. I'm here today because I've been working with Energy Futures Lab for the past 2 years, and the 2 years have gone by really quick. When we were first approached, the Indigenous Advisory Council was asked to help internalize the fact that the energy transition and economic reconciliation with Indigenous peoples need to go hand in hand with the need for balance. And so we've been working really, really closely with the EFL team and the partners to make this happen. So when we talk about the ambition to transform extractive industries into new forms of clean energy, the voices that I don't hear enough of are those of my First Nations, Métis, and Inuit sisters. In the spirit of the energy transition, we need to acknowledge the loudest voices, especially in the natural resources industry, are still predominantly male, especially when they're representing Indigenous peoples. So that's why we are all here to talk to you today. We're elevating the voices of Indigenous women. So thank you to the Energy Futures Lab for your support and for being willing to host a conversation that is only with Indigenous panelists, because we don't often see that happening, or at least it's not enough. So with that, I'm super excited for the next hour. We're going to explore corporate Canada, rematriating corporate Canada, and the energy transition through an Indigenous feminist lens. So now I understand that term sounds a bit scary. So first I want to kind of level set a bit on why Indigenous women and why now. There's a growing push to have a gender lens applied to all clean energy policies, projects, and programs to prevent any risk of disproportionate or unintended consequences for women. It's the intent very much of this notion of rematriating the energy transition as something that is being done with us rather than to us. But what does that mean? It means centering every step of the transition around women, elevating our voices, listening, focusing on our constraints and our challenges so that you can take action and help us alleviate them. It is definitely not about making women responsible for solving all of the problems or any of the messes that has been made. It is about co-creating a path together that centers Indigenous women's points of view. So with that, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to these passionate, powerful women, each who have incredibly inspiring stories, who inspire me, and who are frankly changing the way we think about the energy transition at a time when we need it most. So today we have Jody Anderson, who's the Director of Business Development for the First Nations Finance Authority, Anne-Marie Garby, who is the National Practice Leader for BFL Canada, and Kayla Marie Earle, who's an engineer in training in engineering construction with Enbridge Gas and the Vice Chair of the Canadian Energy Regulators Indigenous Advisory Committee. So let's spend what's left of the rest of the hour unpacking the reasons why Indigenous women are critical to the connection between reconciliation and emissions reduction in our hardest to abate sectors. We'll leave some time for questions at the end from the audience, but if you do have a question you would like to ask, please pop it down in the Q&A box, and let's get started. So ladies, tell us a bit about yourself and why repatriating corporate Canada is important to you. And I'm not going to pick who's going to go first. So we'll just leave it to you. Go ahead, Jody.
Thank you, Raylene Miigwech. Ani bonjour, Jody Anderson, Indigenous, Kuchiching Nandojaba, Ottawa Nanda. In my Ojibwe language, I said, my name is Jody Anderson. I'm a proud member of Kuchiching First Nation, which is located in Treaty 3 territory in northwestern Ontario. Although today I live, work, and play on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin people. So I bring greetings and want to say miigwech to the Energy Futures Lab for the invitation, as well as send out kudos to the Indigenous Advisory Committee, who is doing a lot of fantastic work. So I want to say thank you for that. I'll pass the baton over to the others to introduce themselves first. Anne-Marie, you're next.
My name is Anne-Marie Garby. I am a proud member of the Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation in Treaty 6 territory. I have the honor to sit on the Energy Futures Lab Indigenous Committee with Raylene Whitford, our moderator, and I'm coming to you from Treaty 7 territory amongst our grandfathers in the beautiful Canmore as we know it. I also have the honor of sitting and working side by side with Jody Anderson with the First Nation Finance Authority, and we'll get into that a little bit later. I will pass the mic on to Kayla Marie.
Great, miigwech Anne-Marie, and special thank you to the Energy Futures Lab team for inviting me to be here today. I'm really grateful for the opportunity. Bojo Kinawea, hello everyone. Wasia Indigenous, my Anishinaabe Noswin or Anishinaabeg name is Bright Light. My English name is Kayla Marie Earl. Wikwem Kong Minwa Airland Donjaba, Chatham Kent Dida. I'm from Wikwemekong unceded territory and Airland First Nation in the Robinson, Huron, and Robinson Superior Treaty regions in central and northern Ontario. Chinandem Nongwa, I'm really happy to be here today. So just to answer a bit of what Raylene was mentioning during her introduction, rematriating corporate Canada is necessary because it is foundational to reestablishing systems of matriarchal governance in First Nation, Métis, and Inuit nations. Economic justice to me is the honoring of inherent rights of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis nations, which outwardly includes treaties, Section 35 and jurisprudence, the Royal Proclamation of 1835, and outwardly the framework of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which in Canada is now known as Bill C-15. Rematriating corporate Canada, particularly in energy mining and resource extraction, will establish rightful governing systems and empower Indigenous nations to self-determine, which is what is going to be required in order to pull our communities out of poverty and oppression. So to me, the inclusion of women and two-spirited people in corporate systems allows for the breakage of patriarchal rules that have historically oppressed us and injects the Indigenous cultural paradigms required for us to make better decisions within those industries, which in a nutshell is the fact that Indigenous people understand that humans are not hierarchical above the rest of the planet. We are part of a circle of life. And when we really and truly understand that, even as technical professionals, as everybody making decisions in corporate entities, it really allows us to make better, micro decisions that'll bring us closer to the energy transition. So, miigwech.
Thank you, Kayla. Well said. I love the references. And, when I was first invited to be a part of this panel, I really had to reflect. And sometimes when we look at these types of themes and these types of questions and the work that people are doing, one of the things that's really important to me is reaching out to other women my other matriarchs to hear and listen to what they have to say, because my view doesn't unilaterally mean that's the views of all women or the views of all Indigenous people. And I think that's important to bring to this table here. And my views on it, I really had to think about the word rematriation and reflect on the importance of the meaning of that. And while I believe in rematriation, very much so, I had to think about it in the context of the work that's being done here. And I was thinking, in my discussions with some of my other matriarchs and other women, a very good point was brought up that when you say rematriation, it kind of suggests that we are reinstating something that previously existed. And I don't know that corporate Canada has, historically fully engaged or fully embraced this culture of women in the workplace. And, Kayla, you mentioned it earlier, or it was mentioned earlier about if you look at the boardrooms, if you look at a lot of the committees or the leaders of a lot of our institutions or companies or of corporate Canada, they are predominantly men. So I believe there's space to elevate our women. And this discussion isn't about taking away from men by any means, because I've had the honor of being mentored by a lot of strong, grounded men. And there are a lot of really smart and traditional practices that are happening today that I want to acknowledge. So to that point, if we're looking at this from a context of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which everybody talks about DEI or what that means, if we actually look at what the purpose of that is, it's to be inclusive of many different perspectives, and having and hearing the perspectives of whether it's women or Indigenous people or whatever minority group that you want to consider. And that's to allow so that those perspectives are included in creating policy or the environment or the culture that we're working among. So it's about parity. And if, as corporate Canada, we're really wanting to promote a product or sell a product or want our consumers to consume our product, I believe that it needs to reflect everybody and not just the people that are making the decisions. And someone had said to me, if you look at the boardroom and it's all male Caucasian men that are 50 to 60 years old, what are the chances that policy or that environment is going to change if we continue on that path? So I had to bring in that perspective and really truly listen to what other people are saying and what that means to other women.
That's awesome, Jody and Kayla Marie. Thank you. So I go back to, in my early 20s, I had one of our elders say to me, he said, when we go back to our traditional ways and our matriarchs, having that spot within this broken system, because we're broken. We've been under this colonial structure for so long, and so moving forward, finding that balance. And Raylene, we spoke about this between our masculine and feminine energy. As life givers and water keepers, we have this instinctively strong connection with our environment, with our ecosystem, and we have these balanced relationships with Mother Earth since time immemorial. And so to move forward, we need to find that balance. And that is something that I did not get when I was in my early 20s, when he said this to me. Well, I come from a long line of very strong Indigenous women, and from my late aunties, that to my to the women that are still in my life, and I understand that now, and I see that shift, and we're moving towards that balance. And hence, 10 years ago, we never would have done it like this. And I look at Kayla Marie, and I think I've told you how, you are our future. You are the generations that are coming up, and to me, that is that gives me great pride of where we're going, where are we going for our future. I'm strong in the understanding of that we are going to be okay.
Well, thank you just for that wonderful kind of grounding of this conversation from everybody. Yesterday, actually, I was reviewing a report where Indigenous people only make up 0.9% of corporate directors for listed companies in Canada. So I don't know how many of those are Indigenous women, but I assume it's less than half. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done. And through the rest of this panel, I think we're going to explore some of the different facets where we need to increase the inclusion of women, but specifically Indigenous women as well. So thank you. So we're going to move on to a question for Jody. Economic reconciliation requires a new fiscal relationship that is led by Indigenous peoples and is designed to exercise our autonomy and structure our own solutions. I'd love to just hear your thoughts on a two-parter question. Just given your work with the the First Nations Finance Authority, that's working with First Nations to build capacity and obtain financing from the public markets to get projects off the ground, how is centering Indigenous women a win-win from the work that you've done? And are financial institutions that you work with changing the way that they work with women and Indigenous peoples?
Thanks, Raylene. Two fantastic questions. So number one, let's talk about the First Nations Finance Authority, which I'm currently working at, and I'm really proud to be a part of the First Nations Fiscal Management Act and the regime. One of the reasons that drew me towards the FNFA was the fact that it was focused on financial access to capital, perhaps, but talking more and introducing these terms of financial capacity, finance in general. And in a previous workspace, I worked with AFOA Canada, which was an incredible place to start the discussions on financial wellness and financial literacy in particular, which has a real need in our communities. And I'm going to say that from an Indigenous perspective and a non-Indigenous perspective as well. I think that we don't talk about finances enough. I know certainly when I was growing up, to talk about money was a very taboo subject, first and foremost. And it was almost seen as being rude to ask about career and talk about money, which is starting to change now. The other piece of that is, growing up in a small town, and not just because it's a small town, but the way that I grew up, we didn't have a lot of money to talk about, quite frankly. So it wasn't something that was readily accessible through conversation, let's just say. So I had to do a lot of learning in my later years about what that meant. And I remember taking a course in school about personal finance that really opened up my eyes. And I wish those courses existed at middle school or high school, where we could start to learn about the terminologies and budgeting and the simplification. Anyways, having said that, that kind of drew me into this career path of Indigenous finance, so to speak. And the FNFA really is responsible for providing access to capital to First Nations governments, which didn't really previously exist at affordable rates. If First Nations could obtain financing for particular projects, the rates that they were paying were extraordinary, and some of those rates still exist today. So the option of going if I was to look at the city that I'm living in, Ottawa, Ontario, if Ottawa wants to build any type of large infrastructure, they don't go hat in hand down to the local or commercial bank and ask for a loan. There's a Treasury Board system or an Ontario Financing Authority that allows them to access the capitals at very affordable rates, so that they have cash flow. Cash flow is very, very important to any level of government. And so this is really what the FNFA was set up to do. And we were able to do that through setting up a federal piece of legislation. I think, to date, we've financed almost $2 billion in project financing for First Nation governments alone. We raise capital through the capital markets. So we're not accessing our money through government transfers. And part of this whole regime is about returning power and autonomy back to our First Nation governments, allowing them to build the infrastructure in our communities that's really required. One of the other things that a story that I love to tell is that this First Nations Finance Authority was started by a woman. Her name is Deanna Hamilton, and years ago, she was the tax administrator for West Bank First Nation. And when they created this revenue stream and had substantial revenue, and they took it to a bank, they couldn't get the same affordable rates, even though their revenue streams were quite stable. They couldn't approach the Municipal Financing Authority of BC because it was strictly for municipalities. So she was turned away from a number of different places, and where her, entrepreneurial brain said, we're going to start it ourselves. We're going to embark on this journey of why can't our nations have the same options as our non-Indigenous counterparts or communities or adjacent municipalities? And so she was, the driving force really behind the First Nations Finance Authority. And I think it's important to remember and honor our history. It's still very much a part of the First Nations Finance Authority's history, and not to forget, where we came from, humble beginnings. It starts with a conversation and writing on a napkin. How often have we heard things like that? So I think that really allowed, and I'm proud to say today, we're about to issue our 10th debenture on the capital markets. We have a 0 default rate with all of our loans. And I love telling people that no First Nation government has defaulted on a loan since prior to 1970. And I think that's a myth, that, doing business with Indigenous communities and governments is risky, when in fact, it's not. It's very good practice. So allowing ourselves to continue to create this space is really important in terms of including our women, elevating our women, putting them in leadership positions. And I am proud to say that I do work for an organization that supports that journey specifically.
That is absolutely incredible. And I don't think that we hear that message enough. So thank you, Jody. And just remind us, when was FNFA established? How many years ago?
Almost 20 years ago, but we issued our first debenture in 2014. And since then, we've been climbing, and our deals are getting bigger and bigger. We're probably we are the most successful sectoral governance agreement in Canada to date, which is fantastic. And I'm just honored to be a part of this journey. Incredible.
So yeah, really grateful for the foresight of the founder of FNFA to establish something that 20 years later would be doing this amazing work.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to move on to Anne-Marie, and I think that this is a good segue. So Indigenous women are helping forge mutually supportive environments for economic partnerships that will enable Indigenous people to advance, grow their traditional economies, and prosper as nations. Anne-Marie, you're literally working to change the game on Indigenous equity ownership with a project that will create a First Nations insurance arm. Having this autonomy in the insurance space is really a missing piece for enabling Indigenous communities to come in as true partners in resource development. So can you tell us a bit more about that? Why it's so groundbreaking and why the insurance piece needs to be Indigenous led, and also how the traditional knowledges of Indigenous women weave into all of this? Not a simple question, but something that I'm just so excited to unpack.
Yeah, and it's so funny. We made reference of, well, no, I'm just going to go back to, we're not going to decolonize inherently colonial system, but we can create change within it. And so what we are doing, and very similar to what the FNFA has done, is a very disruptive model within this industry. And I'm going to go back to like our matriarchal approach that supports sustainability, collective growth. We are strong connectors, we are strong collaborators. And so moving forward, we look at, the key word here is sustainable. Right now, meaningful partnership. We see the impacts of climate change, and we see the natural disasters that are impacting our communities. And with that, how are we going to build something that is not profit driven, that is not that's going to build capacity within our nation? So moving forward, and I do believe that encouraging community involvement, interconnected with the community, and taking away this transactional approach, and so from that we are building a 100% wholly owned Indigenous ownership model, and with very creative solutions in light of here we are. It's going to be member owned. That's we do have other insurance markets such as Peace Hill Trust that is owned by Samson Cree Nation. But this is going to be more of a similar model to what the FNFA has done. And so moving towards this and building that capacity is something sustainable. Like we look at, our top 3 sustainable development goals, poverty, that is, across our all of our Indigenous communities, not just in Canada, but worldwide. Food security, good health and well-being. So that there is how do we move forward, and then I go back to, and this is something that I've said numerous times. Like if we go back to our traditional teachings, and what we do today is impacting 7 generations ahead. So we're meeting the needs of people without compromising the ability to meet our needs of our future generations. And this is our teachings. These are things that we need to do as not just within my industry, but every industry and every government. I think that is so important. And what yourself, Raylene, and as somebody that is forging forward within the energy industry, this is something that we're reconceptualizing ownership as stewardship, and these things that are very exciting. And I'll give you one example of what we're doing and on surety. And these are things that, we all give our pats on the back that we are meeting these procurement goals for Indigenous and not understanding that our First Nation contractors that are impacted from Section 89 of the Indian Act do not have that equal opportunity, that equitable opportunity to sit and a bit on these projects that are coming in that are impacting their traditional territories and on their land. So we have a quick example here. Under the underwriting models of acquiring bonding for these projects, you have to have everything financial. I'm not going to go through everything, but our Indigenous contractors are meeting that. But because there's no seizure of assets because of Section 89, anything that's over 200,000, they're not meeting the requirements to actually get this bonding. So that limits them to their growth. And when we see new civil and construction businesses that are coming on and they are having 600 to 700% growth. What is that doing? You know, if we look at our as a whole in Canada, that is heartbreaking to think that, you know, we could have this growth. So with our partner and FNFA, we are working together to break down those barriers. We have found the way to skin the cat so that we have our First Nation contractors that are sitting at the table and being able to have that equal opportunity. So those are a few things that we are doing that is changing the whole landscape across Canada and within the industry.
That's incredible, Anne-Marie. And yeah, thank you for kind of explaining the relevance of insurance and the growth of Indigenous and First Nation-owned businesses. Can you say anything around the participation of women in the insurance industry? Like, I assume it's rather male-dominated. And I imagine that you're one of very few Indigenous women. Can you say some words about that?
You know, yes, it is a very male-dominated industry. You know, if you look at even where the insurance originated, you know, off the shores of London, and so we can see that definitely that it has always been a very male-dominated. I do see some interest, and you know, because I don't think any of us say, oh, we're going to go work in insurance. We just kind of fall into insurance, and that is something. But there is a little bit of representation. You know, I'm actively recruiting all the time of our Indigenous women, and because I think that it is definitely needed. But I do work with some amazing women within this industry, and a part of my team that I'm so proud to. And amazing, like BFL Canada has given us the opportunity to work with the FNFA and on their commitment and to economic reconciliation. So this has been and the recruitment side, which is it's again, anybody on this panel want to come work at BFL Canada, give me a call.
Anne-Marie, I think it's, you know, my experience, just to build on what you're saying, and you're absolutely right. But one of the reasons why we're embarking on this is that we have shown, and we know that when initiatives are First Nations led for our First Nations people, or I should say Indigenous led for our Indigenous people, they're more successful because we bring that perspective and understanding and lived experience to how things operate, how the approach is given. And so that's really what we're trying to achieve here, is continue building our own economy so that it reflects our own values and is inclusive of the things that we need. And one of the questions that I've got a lot is, why insurance? Like, why are we doing this? The reality is that the infrastructure gap that exists on First Nations communities is now being quoted, and their AFN just came out with a recent report, and that number is staggering at $349.2 billion of infrastructure that needs to be created or renovated to meet the same level as our non-Indigenous communities. $350 billion is an enormous amount. So if we were to start attacking this number, we need people to build that infrastructure. And I mean Indigenous people, First Nations, we want to be a part of that opportunity. We don't want to miss out on those opportunities because we can't obtain bonding. The second piece of that also means that $350 billion worth of infrastructure needs to be insured. And we want to do it so that it reflects our own values. So, you know, in connecting the dots, we're trying to think down the road in terms of what our communities need and putting the pieces in now. And it doesn't happen overnight. You know, these things take a really long time to become established. It's a lot of work, but we're not afraid of that.
So what I'm hearing is that rematriating corporate Canada, the energy industry, finance, insurance, requires and means a lot of foresight and a lot of advance, laying the groundwork to make the changes that need to happen to benefit future generations. So thank you for that, both. I see you both as trailbreakers. As our next panelist, Kayla Marie, she's doing some incredible work breaking trail in the energy sector. Now that energy companies are beginning to embrace the development of longstanding, mutually beneficial relationships and partnerships with First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people, they're able to get deals done faster and more efficiently, and better types of longstanding projects that go beyond the minimum terms of consultation. So therefore, I think where we are right now, and this is my view, I think we're in the perfect storm for Indigenous women's voices to be centered and elevated in the context of the energy transition. So Kayla Marie, the next question is for you. Being from Ontario, being an engineer in training with Enbridge, and the vice chair of the IAC with the CER, you truly do have a bird's eye view, both a bird's eye view and an on the ground view, because you work and live in the atmosphere of energy and are building federal energy policies at the same time. So I'm really curious to know, what's your assessment of the energy sector in Canada and its efforts to achieve gender balance? And what opportunities do you see for us to center the voices of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis women in the sector today?
Miigwech, Raylene. I'm not going to talk so much about the regulatory and legal space. I think that those are hard-driven things that we have to follow. That's all coming, and I'm not sure that people grasp what an exceptional impact that Bill C-15 is about to have on the entire nation, but it's really, really coming. Everything from the Ontario pipeline, onshore pipeline regulations are going to change, as well as regulatory processes. And I'm expecting a lot of systemic support for things like Indigenous advisory and monitoring committees, which are on the ground technical supports for energy projects and the interweaving of nation to nation relationships, both with governing bodies of Canada and governing bodies of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. And these things are becoming absolutely necessary in the mitigation of non-technical risk factors to both energy, mining, and all sorts of resource extraction and management projects across the nation. So those are that is coming like a train, but I'm not going to talk so much about that as what I think Indigenous women bring to corporations. So to build on what Jody mentioned earlier, I think in corporate entities, a false narrative exists that diversity and inclusion is a feel-good right thing to do in the name of morality issue. And from what I've seen, every time that funding needs to be cut back, diversity and inclusion efforts are oftentimes the first to suffer. Conversely, safety issues are typically not even considered in budget constraint discussions. Safety is absolutely foundational in energy and mining, and it's what makes me so proud to work in oil and gas. We lead worldwide in safety. So let me break that down for a minute. OSHA governs safety in Ontario, with CCOHS being the nationwide equivalent, and it governs safety through the internal responsibility system, which I guess to summarize it can be described by 3 cogs. The first cog is the individual contributor, which are people on the ground managing everything. The supervisor is right above that, and the manager or the employer at the top. And essentially how systems of safety are built is through reporting. Reporting is what makes the cogs move and what makes that entire safety and internal responsibility system move. When you think about what inspires people to report issues, there has to be a relationship between each of the cogs that allows people to be their authentic self and allows them to feel that they are going to be heard. And if that is not established, the safety system does not work as well, which is a huge determinant of how well our safety systems are going to work to begin with. So when you think about it, inclusion, which is largely led by women, is the grease that keeps these cogs moving. I once asked an elder what the word for safety was and what that meant from an Anishinaabeg perspective. And the elder Will Morin described it as the encompassing of the 7 sacred teachings. So I know that, you know, as an engineering professional, safety has historically been understood as the prevention of injury. But what if we understood it as the preservation of life, to live with honesty, integrity, respect, humility, courage, and love? The impact of inclusion on safety in this regard is exceptional and not a foreign concept to who we already are in energy and mining. It's really just an expansion of values that pre-exist in the industry with new language that oftentimes scares people. And the same paradigm applies to the energy transition. Anishinaabeg and Nakanagewin, our First Nation laws, are determined by rules of the land because we understand that we are part of a circle of creation, which, like a bicycle spoke, weaves outward to apply to so many other ways we do work in energy. And there's so many opportunities there to create new initiatives toward the energy transition. So to put these things together, my experience has been that many of these cultural interjections are carried and spread by women and two-spirited people and injected into corporate strategy by women and two-spirited people, which is really interesting given that women and two-spirited people have historically held these roles for time immemorial, as our people like to say. Many environmental, social, and governmental movements and the interweaving of values of like nurturing values right into the front line are initiated and led by Indigenous women. So when an Indigenous woman is empowered to break the rules a little bit and create new ways to expand and develop understandings of pre-existing values, it's always such a major win, both from a corporate front and from a nation-to-nation relationship building perspective. I've seen it a lot in my 3 years when people get an opportunity to learn these things from Indigenous women largely, it impacts the entire industry and not just, it's not just the right thing to do, it's a great thing to do for your entire corporation. I would also argue that nothing is growing faster than the non-technical risk to energy and mining projects than not properly honoring inherent rights treaties, Section 35, and the Royal Proclamation, all of which comes naturally to an organization when First Nation, Inuit, and Métis women and two-spirited people are empowered through resources, sponsoring, which is more than just mentoring, it's pulling women up into the where you are tangibly. So sponsoring them and giving them title to lead teams. Energy companies need Indigenous women at the board and executive level with their own team and stream of resources, and it's currently not happening, in my opinion. It's absolutely necessary for the future of energy for this to happen. Lastly, I would like to mention that it is the responsibility of allies, especially men, to recognize that diversity and inclusion is not a zero-sum problem. Human rights are not a pie, and you don't lose by inviting Indigenous women and two-spirited people to your decision-making table. Your decisions actually become better when you invite them. Your decisions become more innovative. Your decisions become ultimately enriched through the inclusion of Indigenous women, and you start to become an increasingly meaningful and successful cog in the internal responsibility system for not only the corporation's success and safety, but for the reestablishing of safety and self-determination for First Nation, Inuit, and Métis nations. The inclusion of women breaks complacency and develops a platform for everybody in the entire enterprise to thrive.
You left a lot for us to chew on there, Kayla Marie. Thank you. I think that you're equating the energy industry's safety and upholding of safety procedures, reporting values is important. And from my perspective, I would love to see that be done in equal measure with Indigenous values, which are vast and not the same. But I would hope that we would begin to move towards that direction, at least in my lifetime. So thank you for provoking that thought for me, at least.
Really, may I just jump in on Kayla's beautifully articulated statement. Thank you for saying that, Kayla. And it reminds me of a story that someone recently reminded me of. And it's that, someone could take away, if we look at Mother Earth, or Akikwe, how we say it in our Ojibwe language, if we were to take away the water, we would die. If we were to take away the trees, we would die. If we were to take away our ecosystem, including our animals, we would die. But if we were to take away the humans, Mother Earth, Akikwe, would thrive. And I think we have to keep that in perspective in terms of what that means, that, our Earth is not a resource. It's our relative. And we need to constantly bring that to our discussions and our decisions. So, but first we need to get to Kayla's point, to the decision-making table. So inserting those practices and teachings is really important. And I do see some of that coming through on the ESG scale. Certainly when we're looking at the environmental, social, and governance side of things, I've had lots of conversations with people about what this means, and lots of people will say ESG plus I. I feel like Indigenous people have been practicing ESG for many, many years. And now it's labeled as something, but this is something, we've always been stewards of our own lands. And so this is, from a social perspective, everything we do is for our community, and it's honoring our ancestors, but it's also making decisions for the next 7 generations. And we build our governance systems around that. So thank you for reminding me of that, Kayla.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Jody, for sharing those thoughts. I always hate when corporates or governments kind of boil Indigenous people down to letters. We're not just an I, and we're definitely not a plus I. We have always been here, and we will continue to always be here. So thank you. So we're going to move to some audience questions. So I encourage, if you have a burning question you'd like to ask it, please pop it in the Q&A, and we'll leave some time to get to it. The first one was more of a comment around we need more diversity of Indigenous peoples on boards, and I completely agree with that. It's not really a question. I do think that with this acceptance of Indigenous people and inclusion of Indigenous people in corporate board work, we need to have more. So I wanted to mention that. It's not really a question, but we do acknowledge that. We have one that basically, looking at who we have on the panel here, we have representation from Ontario, Alberta, the Western provinces. So, there might be some who argue that reconciliation efforts in the West are more advanced compared to efforts in Ontario. Just would be interested in your perspectives and what you think needs to be done to improve reconciliation in all provinces and across the country going forward.
I was looking at Kayla because she's also an Ontario girl, but maybe I'll start with that. I see a lot of progress, certainly in the West, with the adoption of UNDRIP and DRIPA. I would love to see it in other provinces right across this country. What I am optimistic of is that I see a lot of corporate Canada, and don't get me wrong, there's still a lot of room for improvement, but they're adopting some of the principles and looking at the articles and looking at the TRC's calls to action and moving forward. And I think people are starting to realize that, if you miss this train, you're going to be left behind, because, to Kayla's point, this is not just about your moral compass. This is good business sense as well. And if you don't engage with our Indigenous people and our Indigenous communities, however that means, whether it's in mining or in energy or whatever that looks like, you're really missing the boat. And people they also don't want to do it just for transactional purposes, that they are following, they know that this is good business. This makes good business sense. And this is meaningful engagement. I find a lot of that spaces, where do we begin? How do we do that? And a lot of corporate Canada doesn't understand yet. And sometimes I'm shocked at the lack of engagement where I expected more. And then sometimes I'm optimistically surprised to say, wow, thank you for doing that. I know one of the questions is like, what are some of the best practices in doing that? Just start the conversation, reach out. And, I really want to acknowledge BFL Canada because they didn't want to come at this from a patriarchal approach. They wanted to say, we want to do this, but we want to do it right. And we need to make sure that we are engaging the right people and creating space in order for this to help happen in a healthy way. And that message is coming out right from their top CEO saying, this matters. This matters not just to me, but it matters to everybody. And while it's important to listen to everybody, when you have that direction from your top leadership, people pay attention.
I can add to that as well. So I think I've chatted about this with a number of people about some of the disproportionate impact of residential schools across the nation. I think because a lot of centralized governing bodies are in Ontario, the impact of residential schools has, without a doubt, been exceptionally harmful in our province. In addition to that, provincial governments are fighting their treaty obligations, which is a direct barrier to establishing First Nation, Métis, and Inuit economic justice in this province. So a good example right now is the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850, which is the territory that I'm from in Northern and Central Ontario. And that treaty was struck just before Ontario formed with the federal government. However, the Ontario specifically has greatly benefited from resource development in that treaty territory. So primarily mining. Mining, like Sudbury, Ontario, is the nickel capital of the world. It is a worldwide significant site for mining. And on top of that, just near the Thunder Bay region in the Robinson Superior Treaty Territory, there is a deposit of chromite there and other pay metals. There's diamonds nearby, there's gold, there's copper. That is significant enough to create another Sudbury. And the province is trying very hard to push through legislation to get mines built faster, specifically the Ring of Fire, which is in that treaty territory. And First Nations are not happy and not responding well, which is creating really high levels of non-technical risk to the work and has already created probably millions, maybe billions of dollars in delays for the work. And, those two things are directly in alignment. If the provincial government is not going to come to the table in a good way to negotiate their retroactive treaty obligations as well as their treaty obligations moving forward, then First Nations are not going to react well when new projects are being put forward. That's a massive barrier. So there's there's one thing there, which is like just nation to nation relationships between the province and the First Nations, and then the federal government and the provincial government having to sit at the table together and strike a deal on exactly what their collective obligation to these treaties are. Because it's probably not just going to be the federal government, because the province has benefited from the land and the mining and the resource development. So that is a humongous barrier. The second barrier, I would say, is corporations, and I'm sure everyone in the audience is highly aware of this, but when you buy stock in a big energy company or a big mining company, it's a pretty solid stock. You're going to get returns, probably even in a recession. So how that happens is through, over a century of building highly robust risk systems. And if the risk systems are so complacent and do not allow for innovation, then it's really hard to get the needle moving on any sort of new practice associated with, for example, building up First Nation enterprises within the company when you have all these old agreements in place. So building innovative financial models so that corporations feel more comfortable taking risk on new things is absolutely necessary to creating business cases to empower like economy with First Nation, Inuit, and Métis nations everywhere. So that's another, I think, important barrier to, developing greater connection between corporate entities in Ontario and First Nation communities. And there are models in Alberta and BC that I'm very excited about, and I'm hoping to work on bringing to Ontario through different means where I can with the Canada Energy Regulator and with the Forward Summit. Where out west, I'm aware of a large oil and gas entity in Alberta and BC where integrity projects along a major transmission line right of way are all managed by Indigenous businesses. And I know of countless First Nation businesses out of Alberta that have grown so much that they have significantly, it's been a significant value add in the growth of self-determination for their specific nations. That is typically what you see, and what I have historically seen with the empowerment of like entrepreneurial initiatives from First Nation communities, is that always adds to the community. And if we can bring more of what Alberta and BC has done to Ontario, as well as try to tear down those provincial federal relationship issues and build those more innovative financial models that allow for more innovation and new ideas to be piloted and built in a systemic way within corporate entities, then that's going to help us. That's going to help the entire nation. Empowering First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities in this way to be more self-determining is going to raise the nation's GDP. Like, it's good for the entire nation.
I completely agree, Kayla Marie. I do not want attendees thinking that putting Alberta on pedestal, because we do have a lot of progress that needs to be made, especially since Métis groups, communities, nations need to apply to have credible assertion with the provincial government, which is just absolutely ridiculous in my opinion. Anyhow, we have 1 minute left. There is a question specifically for Anne-Marie. Is there an Indigenous-owned bonding company that can provide contractors with bonds needed for construction contracts? If so, what is its name?
So right now we are working with the First Nation Finance Authority, and so this is something that is being piloted, and they can reach out to myself or Jody.
Amazing. Well, thank you, ladies. Just to kind of summarize some of the key messages that I heard. So normalizing conversations about finance is really important. And there have been no financial governments who have defaulted on loans. I just want to read what Jody sent to me because I asked her to clarify it, because to be honest, it was just so powerful. No First Nation government has defaulted on any loan since prior to 1970. The perception that engaging in business with First Nations is risky, when in fact it is not. It is just smart business. Also, we cannot decolonize inherently colonial systems, but we can move away from the purely transactional way of doing business. Human rights are not a pie. You don't lose out by including Indigenous people and respecting Indigenous rights, Indigenous women. And my takeaway is that reconciliation continues to be personal. So we will not change the hearts and minds of our large corporations, our governments, until we change the hearts and minds of the individuals who run them and work for them. So hi, everybody. Really enjoyed this conversation. Sorry to everybody who've asked questions that we didn't answer, but I encourage you to reach out to everybody here on the panel and yeah, keep up the great work. Akamemo.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to all those who attended. Miigwech.
Ishnish,
Miigwech for your
everybody.
time, everyone.